My name is Christine Metz, and I'm with Welvy. I've had a number of questions at lunch about who Welvy is. We are the first surgery management company in the nation, and we focus on preference-sensitive surgery, which actually entails about 1/3 of the healthcare spend for health plans and large plan sponsors. And we educate consumers on how to approach a surgery decision in tandem with their PCP, understand risks, benefits, alternatives, and then if they proceed with surgery, how to optimize the event and mitigate complications, errors, infections, and help them understand their own responsibilities in tandem with the hospital and the physician. Now, I'd like to ask each of you, I know most people have been out at lunch, you probably made a couple quick phone calls, so please look at your cell phone and make sure it's on silence also. It is now indeed my distinct pleasure to introduce a man who actually needs no introduction in this audience. Dr. Norm Ornstein is a veteran here and certainly a favorite speaker for all of us. This is actually his 16th time presenting to us all, and we're certainly in for a treat this afternoon. Norm is a resident scholar of the American Enterprise Institute, noted columnist, frequent contributor to the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, a frequent author, and his book last year, co-authored with Thomas Mann, was named one of the top 10 books in the United States in 2012. And for anyone who's not had a chance to peruse it yet, I encourage you to do so, as well as his bio. He was also named one of the 100 most globally influential leaders in 2012. And in addition to the vast array and impressive career he has, he's also known as a centrist and a bipartisan in a city where that is quite rare, I'm afraid, still. So without too much further ado, what I'd like to do is introduce Norm, and please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thanks so much, Christine. It's just a great pleasure to be back. 16 years is quite remarkable. I'm going to put my water here instead of all the way over there. Thank you, Marco, for teaching us. Actually, I was really disappointed. I had hoped when Marco Rubio gave his response to the State of the Union and he reached over that he'd come back with a Dos Equis and he would say, "Stay thirsty, my fellow Americans," but no. I do want to, just as a preliminary, Dean Rosen has had this tradition of referring to the Academy Awards in the movies, and I've developed a small tradition of amplifying a little bit. He mentioned a few appropriate movies, and I want to mention a couple. One, of course, is Lincoln, which won 12 nominations. It is the first time in history, historic, that Hollywood has voted for a Republican president. But I think, Dean, as I've watched, especially watched Ted Cruz make his entry into the Senate and looked at the current state of the Republican Party, that beasts of the Southern Wild defines where the party is maybe a little bit better. This is a very auspicious week in many ways. It's an auspicious week on the election front. There's an election in Kenya, national election, and we're watching it very closely, election mavens, because President Obama's half-brother is actually running for governor of one of the provinces in Kenya. Donald Trump has accused him of being born in the United States. It's been an interesting week for American politicians, one that will no doubt reinforce all of what Americans think. We had one of my great heroes, actually, Pete Domenici, the longtime former senator of New Mexico, father of 8, admit that he's now the father of 9, that he'd actually had an affair 30 years ago with the daughter of one of his colleagues and produced a child. The former San Diego mayor, Maureen O'Connor, admitted that she had frittered away $1 billion fortune gambling. And Jesse Jackson Jr. And his wife went into court and are awaiting sentencing after using $750,000 in campaign funds for personal use. One fortuitous thing, among the things that Jesse Jackson Jr. bought was a $43,000 Rolex watch, which is actually very useful if you're going to be doing time. Other news, Michelle Obama continues to create a buzz over her bangs and said just yesterday that that was a midlife kind of gesture. The bangs have created a lot of controversy. Republicans are demanding further cuts. President Obama is out traveling around the country, but over the weekend played golf with Tiger Woods, which you probably saw, which was just fine until he called Michelle and said that he and Tiger were going to go out for a few drinks afterwards. Didn't play all that well. I've been reflecting over the last couple of weeks on the arc of the past year since we were together. For me, as Christine said, a lot of it revolved around my book, which is called It's Even Worse Than It Looks, how the American constitutional system collided with the new politics of extremism. By the way, it makes a great holiday gift. Doesn't matter what the holiday is. You missed President's Day, hey, post-Valentine's Day, a little, bar mitzvahs, christenings, I don't care. But just thinking back over all of the things that have happened, the quite remarkable presidential campaign, I was actually, just a few days ago, I was thinking of the conventions. I was in Florida where it was 82 and foggy, just like Clint Eastwood. The conventions were interesting. The convention in Tampa, of course, was dominated by the weather, the hurricane, the threat of devastating weather. It caused Donald Trump to cancel his much ballyhooed appearance at the convention. Nobody ever talks about the good things that can come with hurricanes. My favorite moment, though, was when Herman Cain was being interviewed about the weather, and he was asked if he remembered Katrina. And he said, "I've never met her, there's no proof." Some people went a little bit overboard. When I saw Rick Santorum gathering up 2 of every creature at the Tampa Zoo, I thought maybe it's a little bit much. And I went on to the Democratic convention in Charlotte, I actually was very happy. I picked up a couple of campaign buttons. I like to do that. They have all these stands out there, and I got a great big button with a picture of Jenna Jameson on it. Now, I see a couple of people, at least, who know who Jenna Jameson is. Most of you, I'm sure, don't. She happens to be the most successful porn star in America, and she had endorsed Mitt Romney, saying, "I'm rich, so of course I'm going to vote for Romney." So it was a big button that had a picture of it that said, "Porn stars for Romney." And I got it, and I thought, the Democrats are losing the porn star vote. This never would have happened under Bill Clinton. Of course, we had the vice presidential choice, and at least I'm told Paul Ryan is here in town today. Many of us made predictions about what would happen, and some of us were spectacularly wrong on the election itself, Karl Rove and Dick Morris, among others. But I was just completely wrong on the vice presidential choice. I was confident that Mitt Romney would pick Newt Gingrich, because I thought you got the perfect balanced ticket. You got a Mormon and a polygamist. I mean, but it's neither the first nor the last time that I will have been wrong. I want to do a few things today before we have our dialogue. I want to reflect back a little bit on the election and what it means for the parties. It was quite a A stunning election in a lot of ways, as Dean's slide showed, and also reflects in some ways not just the demographic challenges in the country that I'll talk about, but the demographic and other changes, social changes in the society. We now have 8 openly gay members of Congress, including our first openly declared bisexual, Kristen Sinema of Arizona. It was a very difficult contest for her. She won in a razor-thin margin because she won the swing vote. But what was particularly interesting, I thought, as I sat on election eve, and this time I was working with BBC, but watching what other networks were doing and talking to a lot of people out in the field. And it was stunning to see how many seasoned observers, all the way up to Mitt Romney himself and his campaign team, were confident right up until late evening on election eve that Romney was going to win and win in a walk. It wasn't even going to be close. And they were stunned, just stunned, to lose, and not just to lose, but to lose handily. Now, you expect, and normally we think, you get people who go out and they do a lot of spin, but privately they know what's really going on. In this case, the private views were the same as the public views. And how could you be so wrong? Well, one part of it is, and it's an important part as we look ahead to all of these policy challenges, the enormous degree to which a self-reinforcing mechanism driven by mass media and social networks now exists that gets people thinking in a certain way and then just keeps reinforcing it. So if you wake up every day and you turn on talk radio and listen to Laura Ingraham and Rush Limbaugh, and you read the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and you get your emails from friends and relatives telling you things that are absolutely, obviously true, even if they're not, and you see this phenomenon not just on one side, you come to believe stuff and you filter out evidence that might go the other way. Some of it flowed from, in the similar fashion, this absolute belief that how could Americans continue to vote for a Kenyan-born socialist who was so outside the mainstream and so obviously trying to destroy the fabric of America? But a lot of it, for the seasoned insiders as well, flowed from something else, which was a belief that the 2008 election was an anomaly, that the spike in turnout from African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and younger Americans, and the overwhelming votes that they cast for Barack Obama just were not going to happen again. And that the election of 2004, when George W. Bush won with a narrow positive popular vote margin, and the election of 2010, when Republicans won sweeping victories across the board, were the norm. And that's a norm that meant that you could define yourself as a party to turn from movies to books as 50 Shades of White. That you don't need other voters if you can dominate the white vote, especially the white working class vote. But that's not how it worked. And what's happened now is an awful lot of people who were confident going in and have come out shaken have started to realize the relentless changes in demographics in the country, and that winning over additional shares of other voters is a necessary component if you're going to compete to be a majority party. And how do you do that? The fact is we're adding proportionally about 2% of non-white voters, minority voters, to the electorate every year, and we're moving in a very different direction. And all of that has created a lot of turmoil inside Republican ranks. And I think you could say that there are three strains of thought on this front, all of which are relevant, once again, for not just politics, but the dynamics as we go through the policy process. One group I call the Rush Limbaugh faction, and that is the never give up, never surrender strain of thought. I don't care what those results are. We're not going to change a thing, because if we did, we would lose our core, we would lose our soul, and besides, we've done everything we can do or should do to win over other voters. My God, we've got Clarence Thomas. We got Marco Rubio. What more do they want? So you've got that strain. Now, in terms of overall numbers, that may not be huge, but in terms of influence, it is. First of all, it's because it includes a very substantial share of that self-reinforcing wind machine. It is the talk radio hosts and some of the editorial writers and an awful lot of the people doing blogs, and they influence a much larger collection of people. And if you were to break out the primary voters, you'd probably find a very substantial share of them would share that view. Now, the second group I would call the Charles Krauthammer team, and Charles Krauthammer being, of course, another prominent opinion leader and columnist. And that view is basically, all right, we get it. But all we've got to do is get back to the same proportion of Hispanic American votes that George W. Bush got in 2000 and 2004, 40 or 45%, and we can go back to competing for the 50.1% that Karl Rove was able to gin up in 2004, and we can win elections. And all we got to do is pass an immigration bill. Just turn amnesty from a 4-letter word to a 7-letter word, flip that one switch, and we're done. We don't have to change anything else. Now, the third group is basically the Jeb Bush group. And this is a group that's led by people like Jeb Bush, Mitch Daniels, Haley Barbour, probably Bobby Jindal, Chris Christie, and a number of others, all of whom, by most conventional standards, are conservative. Most of whom, by conventional standards, are pretty conservative. And notice that I don't have a fourth group of moderates because they're just a trace element at this point and not relevant in most of the larger discussion. But this is a group that recognizes that if you're going to respond to that larger challenge, you're going to have to change more than just a flip switch on immigration. And a part of what has, I think, driven this group, as they've looked a little bit more deeply at the demographics, is there was an expectation among a lot of the pros that this time, while they might not do well with Hispanic voters, they would do much better with Asian Americans. Because after all, you've got a group of people who are highly educated, a lot of small business people and entrepreneurs, a lot of professionals who, just looking at their backgrounds and where they are, ought to resonate to that market-oriented conservative message. But what they've come to realize, because it didn't work that way, just as in 2008, Asian Americans went 2-to-1 and a little bit more for Barack Obama, is that if the message is fundamentally government, bad, private sector, good, that you're missing something, that you've got a lot of people who got to this country because of government, who got a safety net and a leg up because of government, who got their kids educated so that they could move on to become successful professionals because of government, and that you need a more sophisticated message that reaches them at a different level, and also a message that doesn't go to an immigration issue reluctantly and tries to impose as much penalty on undocumented workers as possible, that sends another message. We don't like people of your kind here, but something that's a little bit different. And at the same time, not just because of those demographics, but for larger reasons, has to bring a theme and message to the 21st century that fits the 21st century. one very interesting article that I think also reflects on some of these issues moving past the demographics, written by Ramesh Ponnuru, who's now a colleague of mine and Joe's just a few days ago, on how some of the same messages that came out of the Reagan era have to be adjusted because the conditions are just different than they were in the Reagan era. And all of this means a raging debate going on in intellectual circles and in political circles. But a lot of it is getting pretty vicious because you're looking at more than just some ethereal questions about what message you're going to promote. You're also talking about raw power and a lot of other fundamentals, including the fact that many of the divisions here flow from larger questions that are there in the society as a whole and almost always are when populism emerges. And a lot of people in the grassroots and many of their leaders, some of them prominent figures in Congress, have nothing but distrust for the establishment figures of the past who, when they say, we got to change, trust us, are just not going to find any resonance out there. And you see some of this playing out now, interestingly, in the attacks on Karl Rove as he's tried to deal with one level of the pathology that's occurred, which is responsible for another one of the figures that Dean put up there, the stunning results in the Senate elections, where, as Dean said, a year ago, everyone would have predicted that Democrats, with almost twice as many seats up in the Senate as Republicans, would lose seats. Some thought they could lose enough to lose the Senate. You could have been optimistic as a Democrat and say, well, we may be able to break even. But nobody would have predicted a gain of 2 seats. But that gain of 2 came about as much as anything because Republicans, for the second election in a row, took several seats that were surefire winners and snatched defeat from the jaws of victory by nominating candidates who were, what's the technical term? Lunatics. And if you go from a 2010 election where Mike Castle, the last moderate Republican in the House, he turned the lights out as he left, but also the most popular figure in Delaware, including Joe Biden, ran for the Senate, and in a state with roughly 1 million population, but a primary that had about 30,000 participating, lost his party's nomination to Christine O'Donnell. Remember Christine, who had her 15 minutes of fame. Then went through a very rough period when she was investigated by the FBI for alleged misuse of campaign funds for personal purposes. She called it a witch hunt. May have a point there. And then you segue to the Richard Murdochs and the Todd Akins of the world. You're losing seats that by every measure you should have won. So Karl wants to create a new fund to intervene in primaries and try and get conservative candidates who are not lunatics nominated. Now, part of his problem is you're like a hedge fund manager who took $300 million investment and put it right down the toilet without a single winning candidate this time around. But a part of it is a backlash that who are you to tell us which candidates we ought to have? It's up to voters to decide. And by people who care less about winning a specific election. The goal is not winning an election. The goal is changing America and revolutionizing it and implementing your program and convincing people one way or another to do it. And all of that is playing out with a lot of tension. Now, it's tension that happens when you have a party that loses several elections. It's tension that isn't going to go away. And to some degree, frankly, it's tension that has been there for many, many decades. If you look at some of these divisions, you could look at earlier iterations going back to Robert Taft against the establishment Republicans in the 1940s. But at the same time, it makes it very difficult to focus and develop a strategy going forward. And it becomes a particular challenge for those people in government trying to govern. And the greatest challenge, probably the toughest job in politics, if not in America right now, is that of John Boehner, trying to navigate his way through a lot of this. Now, I'll come back to the Republicans, but let me talk for a couple of minutes about Barack Obama and a second term. This is a different Barack Obama in a whole lot of ways. Every president who wins a second term changes. Every president going into a second term knows that if you lose, you are at best a footnote in history. One-term presidents don't become major figures. Now, most presidents who run for re-election win re-election. Interestingly, if you want to look for the single best indicator heading into an election season about whether a president will be a one or two termer, it is whether that president is challenged from within his own party, usually from his left or right, depending on the party, a debilitating challenge that forces you away from the center, that uses up a lot of your resources, that divides your own party, is a surefire sign that you're in deep trouble. So whether it was Jerry Ford, challenged by Ronald Reagan in 1976, Jimmy Carter devastated by Ted Kennedy in 1980, George Herbert Walker Bush wounded by Pat Buchanan in 1988. One of the reasons that Mitt Romney, Karl Rove, and others should not have been surprised at Obama's victory was he didn't have that kind of challenge. But obviously, they knew that it was no surefire thing. And Obama knew that if he were a one-term president, he would be a larger footnote in history than most presidents, the first African-American elected to the White House. But now he is the first African-American re-elected, and it's different. And it's different because you have a chance as a two-term president to really make a mark in history. And most presidents are ambitious enough that that's what they want to do. At the same time, you come back, if you've been through a rough re-election campaign, feeling a sense of vindication if you win. Voters have looked at you, they've looked at what you've done, and they've decided to rehire you. So you've got a burst of energy that comes with that. And yet, smart second-term presidents, and President Obama has read a lot about the second terms, also know that a second term is harder. You don't have the same impetus that you have when you first enter the presidency. It's harder to get new ideas implemented. You usually have smaller margins to work with inside Congress, and you usually end up with major headaches from your own base. A successful second-term president who fends off that challenge basically puts off the base by saying implicitly or explicitly, cut me some slack here, I got to run for re-election. And in that message is, if I win re-election and I don't have to worry about it again, you can get what you want. So the expectations are particularly high for members of your base, but the political realities are such that you can't fulfill those expectations. And for Barack Obama, we don't see it so much now. And it may be damped down a little bit because of the intensity of the opposition on the other side. But assuming, as I think is a fair assumption, that Obama now okays the Keystone Pipeline, you're going to see the environmental left go to DEFCON 1. And they're already preparing for that. And if we ever do get some additional tranche of debt reduction, a third step on the fiscal cliff, that includes any significant changes in Medicare or change CPI. We've already got 100 members of his base in the House who've signed a petition saying, make no changes, and a lot of forces on the outside mobilizing that will be very upset. And you have a labor base which once again provided a good share of the ground troops and the efforts to win him re-election, that was particularly disappointed and foiled in the first term. Their number one goal, of course, was card check, changing the method of union elections, and they didn't even get a watered-down version of that. And now, with the National Labor Relations Board pretty much out of business, and with no real opportunity, given the political dynamics, to implement the rest of it, you're probably going to find some unhappiness there, although much of that will be deflected to the states where they're fighting their own wars over right to work. But all of that is a challenge for the president. But what you also see with Barack Obama is somebody who's been tempered by 4 years of tribal warfare. And let me just step back for a second and give you a little bit of the thesis of the book, the one that makes a great holiday gift. It's the one I'm referring to. And it really is that, first, that in the 43-plus years that I and my co-author, Tom Mann, Brookings, have been in Washington, immersed in our policy process, we have never seen it this dysfunctional. It never looks pretty. It wasn't designed to be terribly functional. That's why the title is It's Even Worse Than It Looks. But the fact is the level of polarization, ideological and partisan, is simply sharper, and it's not difficult to actually show that. It's not just anecdotal. But more than partisan and ideological, it's become tribal. And the tribal part of it is a particular challenge. You can overcome a lot of sharp ideological differences. First of all, there are a number of issues where they don't really break down on left-right lines. And an awful lot of others, there's still a lot of areas where you can either find common ground or figure out ways to make trade-offs. And you can see this very obviously on things like the debt problem, where every time we get a group of people together, the outside commissions like Simpson-Bowles and Rivlin-Domenici, designed to span the ideological spectrum, the inside group originally called the Gang of Six that went from Tom Coburn, who calls himself justifiably the most conservative member of the Senate, all the way over to liberal Dick Durbin of Illinois. They all come up with the same template. 2 years ago it was, let's do $4 trillion in debt reduction over 10 years, roughly a third of it or so coming from taxes, and the rest from a balanced approach, digging into all of the programs, including especially the big ones. And you can argue over which portions come from where and how you do it, but you've got that template. And that's true across a range of issues. But if you're tribal, basically the attitude is, if you're for it, I'm against it, even if I was for it yesterday. And that's how the policy process played out for Obama over the course of his first 4 years. So on that debt reduction front, when, just to pick two quick examples, in early 2009, we had a commendable bipartisan effort. Conservative Republican Senator Judd Gregg of New Hampshire joined with moderate Democrat Kent Conrad of North Dakota to propose a congressionally mandated commission to deal with the debt problem, bring it up, and get expedited votes up or down in both houses of Congress. And practically speaking, there wasn't a day that went by after the commission got introduced when Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, didn't go out in a speech or in a television interview or on the floor of the Senate and say, we can solve this problem. We just need the Gregg Conrad Commission. If we had the Gregg Conrad Commission, we could move past this. We could get to other issues that really matter for Americans if only the president would support the Gregg Conrad Commission. And then a few months later, the president endorsed the Gregg Conrad Commission. And shortly after that, it came up for a vote in the Senate. It got 53 votes, but it was filibustered. And it fell 7 votes short of the 60 hurdle that was necessary. 7 original Republican co-sponsors of the Gregg Conrad Commission voted against their own proposal and for the filibuster, as did Mitch McConnell. If he's for it, we're against it. Now, a short while later, we had the Gang of Six, the Coburn et al. Group. And when they came out with a report, President Obama said, I can work with that. We can make that work. And the same day, Mike Allen, a reporter, editor with Politico, got an email from a top aide to the Republican Senate leader saying, well, that kills that. If he's for it, it's going nowhere. Now we have another more contemporary example that shows elections may matter, but they don't leach some of the dynamics out of the system. When we had the leak of the immigration plan that the administration had been considering just a few days ago, we had an immediate reaction from Marco Rubio, John Boehner, and a whole bunch of others. This is going to kill the process. It's outrageous. This is way out of bounds. Now, if you looked at the plan and put it side by side with the Rubio plan, the differences are not all that great. They're easily bridgeable. In fact, they're very close in a whole host of areas. But then Newt Gingrich went on national television and said, well, look, any plan that he's going to put out there, we're going to vote against. So we've still got those problems. And it took Obama 3.5 years to move away from this belief that he had first articulated when he exploded onto the national stage in 2004 at the Democratic Convention in Boston. We're not a group of red states, a group of blue states. We're the United States of America. The notion that we could transcend these divides and create a post-partisan America. And frankly, the ego-driven notion that he could do it almost single-handedly. It proved simply not to be the case. Now I think we see a very different approach. It is a more gimlet-eyed approach to governing. And it's an approach also that brings back something that he strangely ignored largely during his first term, which is the weapon of the bully pulpit, going out not just to mobilize people. They're now doing it in a fashion we hadn't seen before, which is using the political organization and the social network that they developed in 2008 and expanded in 2012 as a weapon in the policy world. I'm a little more skeptical about that working, or about transforming the public. But what a president can do is frame an agenda in a fashion that can put additional pressure on the other side, instead of letting them frame what the agenda is. And we're seeing that now play out on the sequester and in other ways. And also a recognition on his part that we're now dealing, given all of these divisions, with two very different institutions in the Senate and the House. The Senate is filled, Senate Republican caucus is filled much more with people who are sympathetic to the Jeb Bush, Mitch Daniels approach to governing. And the House has probably 100 to 120 Rush Limbaugh'ites. You've got a Senate where you have a bunch of Republicans who are ready to deal because they see themselves as problem solvers, not as revolutionaries. And I had an interesting conversation a couple of years ago where I could see this incipient move with Bob Corker of Tennessee, who just got reelected to a second term, a former mayor of Chattanooga. And Corker was basically saying to me, you know, in a couple of years, my 6-year contract with the people of Tennessee will be up. And I really don't want to look back on it and say, what did I do in 6 years? I voted no on everything. That's not what he sees as his role or why he's in public life. And you've got a lot of others along those lines. Now, not all of them. We have the Ted Cruz, Mike Lee, Rand Paul faction, which is a significant one, which is very much over there on the revolutionary. It's not even a conservative side. It's much more radical than that. But a very substantial number of Senate Republicans look at it in a different way. And if you're Mitch McConnell, you move past your famous statement made repeatedly over the previous 2 years. My number one goal is to make Barack Obama a one-term president. And realize that now, you could say your number one goal is to make Barack Obama a two-term president, but mission accomplished. And the lame duck status that normally weakens two-term presidents in the era of the permanent campaign, where now crippling him to avoid a third term doesn't work, could turn in a different direction. And if you're McConnell and you want to win enough seats in the 2014 midterms to capture the majority, and you've got, once again, many more Democrats up and many of them vulnerable, and few Republicans who themselves are vulnerable up, the message of we're going to obstruct everything he wants probably doesn't work with this electorate now. And a message where you've managed to work together to solve some problems and we can make divided government work is probably going to operate much better. Now, the caveat there is Mitch and his number 2 leader, John Cornyn, are both up themselves in 2014. And while McConnell may face a challenge from Ashley Judd or somebody else, wouldn't that be fun? He's far more worried about a potential primary challenge in a state where he doesn't control his own party anymore. He put everything he could into keeping Rand Paul from winning a nomination in his own state and failed miserably. Now he's hired Paul's campaign manager to be his campaign manager, but he's a little bit worried on that front. And John Cornyn watched Ted Cruz trounce the lieutenant governor, who was a very conservative figure and perhaps the most powerful Republican in the state. The lieutenant governor really runs the state and has to be a little worried himself. But in general, they know that operating in the same way that they did before didn't work, cost them seats in the Senate. And so there's a real desire there to work together. And that's why we got 89 votes for the deal that McConnell worked out with Joe Biden on the fiscal cliff in the Senate. And that 89 votes included a number of figures. Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania, the former head of the Club for Growth, Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma, who could provide a real challenge to Tom Coburn for being the most conservative, and Coburn himself voting for it, a plan that raised taxes from the rich. But when it went to the House, despite having that kind of imprimatur, John Boehner could barely get 70 Republicans to support it. They didn't care if you had Toomey and Coburn and others on board, because it's a very different place. In the House, John Boehner has to face a couple of realities. One is that probably 100 of his members come from districts that are homogeneous echo chambers where their constituents get their information from Limbaugh, from emails that go viral and in other ways, and that's what they hear back home, where their only concern is a primary-driven challenge from the right, and where any sanctions that the speaker might offer are pretty meaningless. In this day and age, there isn't anything that can be done to them, and they view the world in a very different way. And any kind of notion that, well, we've got to protect our majority or try and stay in a pragmatic position just doesn't work for them. And Boehner's attempt to keep them in line by singling out 4 of their colleagues who had ignored him and defied him and removing them from powerful committees didn't work at all. And the fundamental reality we face now is that Barack Obama can do business with the Senate and probably get a number of things, from immigration to guns to infrastructure, through with substantial bipartisan majorities there. And they can pass the House. And that may be true of another fiscal deal. But every one of them will only pass the House with more Democrats than Republicans. Now, if you're the Speaker, you are a constitutional officer. It's your first mention in the Constitution. You're elected by the whole House. But you're a party leader. And there are only so many times you can go to the well and bring things to the floor that will pass with more members of the other party than yours before you're toast. He's already done 2. Did the fiscal cliff. He did Hurricane Sandy. How many more? And under what conditions? And for Obama, it's basically a recognition that you're going to have to get the Senate to pass those things and then put enough public pressure on and enough of a sense that if they don't do anything, they're isolated, they're out there, they're alone, that Boehner will move in that position and maybe get enough Republicans to go along. That's the first challenge ahead. I'll just mention a couple of others. One of the things that Obama also realizes, which is true for second-term presidents, is Congress is always going to be a heavy lift, and your temptation is to bypass them, not just by going to the public, which is a shaky thing, but by using executive power. And you are going to see more and more efforts to use executive action, whether it's executive orders, regulation, or simple steps taken by your agencies to implement things that you want if you can't get anywhere in Congress. And you will see all kinds of efforts by Republicans, especially in Congress, to thwart him from doing that, either by using the power of the purse, by holding up nominations, or finding other ways to make life miserable. But expect a lot of tugging and hauling. Now, what does all of this mean? To step back, and you've heard an awful lot about what it means in terms of health policy. One is, it means another year or two of enormous headaches in trying to figure out which direction policy will go in. And if you're working in government, the nightmare for managers of knowing, first, that if you go through another series of rolling confrontations and another year in which you have no idea whether you'll have a budget, what money you'll have to spend from day to day or week to week, where you may have to deal with a sequestration, which is at this point almost inevitable given where the House is, even though it's not where Boehner wants to be. And all of those earlier struggles I was telling you about. So John Boehner, in his effort to try and blame the president for the sequester, writes a piece in the Wall Street Journal saying, this is awful, we don't want it to happen, it's his fault. And he gets filleted by Rush Limbaugh, who says, what do you mean we don't want this to happen? Yes, we want it to happen. Bring it on. Who are you anyhow? This way we get our cuts and, you know, big deal. It may cause a little pain. That's all right. But you're going to have to go through that as a manager, and you're going to have to furlough people and figure out how you're going to operate. Then we segue to a potential shutdown of government, more furloughs, more difficulty figuring out what you can do or can't do, and maybe have your office shuttered for a few weeks. And if previous experience is any guide, it may be more than one shutdown. Shut down for a while, you come back, you do another one. How can you make any long-term plans? How can you operate? Implementing the Affordable Care Act, given all the other obstacles that we know are there, given the challenges to a number of the more controversial parts of the plan, but under a set of circumstances where we still have an acting head of CMS, where there'll be challenges on the appropriations front, and where you're going to have this responsibility to roll out these exchanges in all of these states that, for very good pragmatic reasons, if I'm a governor and I've got to put an exchange in place, and I'm the one responsible, and I got to do this complicated process in 6 or 8 months, and there'll be glitches and hang-ups and problems, I'll get blamed for it. Why not let them get blamed for it along the way? But if you're going to have to move in a crash way to put those programs together, and you don't have the budget to do it, and you don't know how you're going to do it, and you're going to have guerrilla warfare hitting you from all sides, and if you're out there on the firing lines in the provider community trying to deal with this, this is going to be an enormous set of challenges ahead. Now, I could weave a scenario where we actually have a reasonably productive year. The fact is, last year, if somebody had said, well, what are the chances we'll get an immigration bill in the next few years? I would have said 0. It's not possible. Guns? Forget it. They're nowhere on the table. The immigration issue shows that elections can matter. The gun issue shows that events can matter, although it took about 10 of them before we reached the tipping point that Newtown provided. But that you could get a significant, rigorous gun check and something comprehensive on immigration that could provide some path to citizenship for undocumented workers would be stunning. That we could move on and maybe do some other things and even be talking about implementation of the Affordable Care Act and not repeal at this point, all of that is pretty astonishing. We're not that far away from that next tranche of debt reduction where we could at least stabilize the debt to GDP ratio for enough time that we could then really think about and get into a good debate on, and a constructive debate on larger structural changes. But the odds of all of that happening without the kind of turmoil that I'm talking about are, as George W. Bush would say, slim to none, and Slim just left the building. So with that, I'll end on my traditional piece of good news. The book is selling just terrifically well, and I'm very happy to take questions or comments.
And Paul Brower from Orange County Urology. Senator Chris Dodd recently spoke to a colleague of mine and suggested that the problem that we currently exist with this tribal warfare has all to do with the success of the parties at a state level to have achieved gerrymandering of the local districts, which then allows them to do what you said, where you have districts that are virtually 100% controlled by one extreme group, and so that's the only place that they have to pander. Is that your view as well?
I don't like gerrymandering. I've spent a fair amount of time trying to ameliorate it, working in states to get something akin to what Arizona's done, Iowa's done, and now California has done. It's done some bad things, but we make a big mistake if we think that that's the root of the problems. It wasn't gerrymandering that cost Bob Bennett of Utah, who had a voting record that was one of the 5 most conservative in the Senate, the ability even to run for re-election statewide in Utah because he had had the temerity to work with Ron Wyden, a progressive Democrat, on a health care plan. Even though we voted against his own plan and voted against the Affordable Care Act, he had committed the apostasy of, well, he didn't sleep with the enemy because of those votes. He got to first base. And that's all you had to do to win the enmity. The culture is a larger problem. The redistricting, by the way, is not the only thing responsible for the anomaly, or what we would normally have thought of as an anomaly this time. The Democrats won a majority of the popular vote for the House, but lost the majority of seats. Usually you get a little bonus. But as we look more widely, what we see is there really is a phenomenon that's called the big sort. People have begun to sort themselves out geographically into like-minded areas, and the nature of the districts is such that Democrats are packed into urban districts, and their turnout tends to be a little bit higher than some of the other more diverse and Republican districts, so we get that phenomenon. Now, if we did away with gerrymandering, which is not all that easy to do given the nature of these districts, but if you had a fairer distribution, it would help. But we got to do more than that. And among other things, you've got to dilute the impact of the smaller but potent groups who dominate these primaries. And frankly, you also have to see changes in a campaign finance system where now there's enormous leverage for a small number of highly influential individuals and groups who can dominate this process. You know, when Boehner tried to come up with an alternative on the fiscal cliff to Obama, just to get some traction for negotiating. Now, I think it was stupid to call it Plan B, because I thought, why is Boehner supporting the over-the-counter drug? But one of the first things that happened is the Club for Growth basically warned any Republican in the House who supported Boehner on this that they'd get a primary challenge financed from the outside. You know, that's not great. So the California system of open primaries, if we combined it with preference voting, would be helpful, expand the electorate. Far more important than redistricting, if I could do one thing, which isn't going to happen, it would be to bring us the Australian system of mandatory attendance at the polls. In Australia, you don't have to vote. You can cast a ballot for none of the above. But if you don't show up and you don't write an excuse, I can't be there, I'm sick, I'm traveling, the dog ate my vote card, whatever it may be, you're subject to a fine, a modest fine, about $15 to $20. And they get 90% plus turnout in every election. Now, you know, high turnout is not an end in and of itself. It doesn't prove the health of a political system. The former Soviet Union regularly had 98% turnout. Chicago gets to 110% at times. But what they will tell you in Australia is if both bases are turned out, the consultants, the Roves or Carvilles, don't have the incentive to scare the crap out of their own base to gin up their turnout and suppress the other side's base. They're both going to be there, and the politicians focus on the voters in the middle. And it changes the issues and the rhetoric. but we're not going to do that. We don't like mandatory anything. So if I could combine preference voting, open primaries, and move the election to the weekend with some early voting for people who are going to be away on the weekends, we would start to get somewhere where we could expand the electorate, and that would be more important.
I'm Ted Bertamy from northern Santa Barbara County. What is your take on the recent viral spread of the message of Dr. Ben Carson from Hopkins, especially in this era where the depth of political thought for the low information voters limited to 140 characters?
I like Ben Carson a lot, and I think he's got the potential to be a very influential figure. But I also think that we live in a world where the 140 characters, the short attention span that's caused by the remote control and other things, the cacophony of messages, the demand for breaking news and instant information and all of that, it masks the fact that people are also looking for something more and deeper. And you know, I must say, when I went to see Zero Dark 30, and I went with my older son, and we were driving back, and I said, that was 2.5 hours. I said, Lincoln is 2.5 hours. Les Mis is 2.5 hours. 10 or 15 years ago, movies were mostly an hour and 20 minutes. And you know, the whole thesis was people won't sit for any longer than that. And this tells me something. And it also suggests to me, one of the things I've suggested to the White House is have the president do a series of lectures. I've talked to some of his former law students who said he was a fabulous professor. Do a lecture in an auditorium like this or with a group of students. Put it on YouTube. Pick any topic where you kind of give a reasoned approach. Here's what the problems are. Here's what we ought to do about them. You're not going to get 100 million people, but you'll get 2 or 3 or 5, and it'll get out there on YouTube. And I think there's a market for those sorts of things. And there is a market for thoughtful people. We have a hard time finding opinion leaders. There isn't an institution in America, save the military, that has a high approval rating in the country right now, and very few figures. And the military is now going through its own rough patch of scandals. And you know, the one guy you would have thought of, well, who can transcend all of this? David Petraeus. Oops. So that's a problem, but they're out there. There are people who can provide that opinion leadership, and we got to find vehicles to make that happen. And some of that stuff, if you get it out there, will go viral. I'm not sure he wants to pursue a political future, but it wouldn't surprise me. I also think, you know, in another place you see it is with Atul Gawande, who also, I think, he hasn't shown quite as great a capacity because, you know, it's still a little bit different. Ben Carson, you know, it's still, if you're a brain surgeon, somehow you know, get a little more traction. But you can have people in this field who can change views and get people thinking in a different way and move outside the normal political environment. And it may be better if he doesn't have a political future, because no matter what, you'll get caught up in the tribalism. And you know, there may be no better example of that than the oracle from Lincoln, Nebraska, who you know, was probably as highly regarded as anybody until he said, "Why should my secretary be paying a higher tax rate than me?" And then all of a sudden, he gets the heavy guns focused on him from one side because he's taken a side. So staying out of the political arena may be a better approach.
Dick McDonald, retired from Central Illinois. Follow up to my question to you last year. How's Grover Norquist doing?
Well, first, Grover Norquist has had what you could say was a wonderful year. He's on the cover of news magazines. He is viewed as one of the major movers and shakers in the country. He loves all of that. Now, at another level, it is no longer the case that the no taxes pledge has the same enormous overweening power that it had before on people. And he lost, in a sense, with the fiscal cliff deal. And taxes, no matter what is being said, are still on the table, and you're not going to have any larger deal without some additional revenues, however they may come in. But the fact is, if you're sitting there as Grover Norquist, whether you are the subject of vilification by a lot of Democrats and mainstream press people, whether you win all of your battles or not, you are a national figure who's had a huge impact and who remains a heavy national figure. And you have a party that, by and large, is still clinging to your pledge and what it means in large numbers. So if I were Grover, I'd be feeling pretty good right now, even if it didn't work out entirely the way I'd hoped. What is just as interesting is what happens to Wayne LaPierre and the NRA, I might say. And there, I think the danger may be greater for them. They're at risk of losing some of their own base if they continue to take a tough stand. The National Rifle Association started as an association of sportsmen, sports people, recreational shooters, and a large share of that base agrees with Joe Manchin. You know, if I'm out there hunting, I don't need a 100 bullet capacity magazine. I don't need cop killer bullets. I don't need assault rifles. But they're coming up against, and this is another element, I should say, of the tribal problems that we face. A group of people who say, well, we should have access to every weapon that the government has access to because the whole reason behind the Second Amendment is to protect us from the government. They got bazookas, we need bazookas. Now, you know, however you want to read the Second Amendment, somehow the phrase a well-regulated militia may be lost in that process. But that virulent anti-government sentiment, which again is reinforced by emails and social media that convince people that the government is out to get you, take your guns, force you to be on some set of government registers where they'll spy on you all the time, is a growing group that is of enormous significance. And they can be marginalized in some ways, but it's a mistake to think that that's just a handful of lunatics now. It's a more substantial group of people, and they have political force. So that's a shoehorning in a different answer, but
Hi, I'm Mark Miller. I have a question about a group that I don't think we talked about too much, Senate Democrats. So Mitch McConnell went around Harry Reid and cut his deal with Joe Biden. Does that mean Harry Reid is not relevant, or to what extent do you see that?
Harry Reid was just asked by a reporter if he would run again in 2016, and he said, sure, why not? So Harry's going to be around. And he is basically in very strong shape with his own caucus and his own colleagues. They like him, they admire him. He's still the leader, and he's clearly the leader. His relationship with McConnell is a mixed one. And there will be times when Biden, who has a closer relationship, will parachute in and deal with it. But that didn't bother Reid at all. He doesn't feel any pride of authorship there. It's a question about how much you can hold your 55-member caucus together. And there's a challenge to Democrats because, you know, I talked about McConnell and Cornyn being up next time. You've got a number of significant, nervous Democrats who are up. Max Baucus, Mary Landrieu, who have to worry themselves. And keeping them together on issues like immigration and guns may not be all that easy. And keeping them all together on a fiscal deal that includes taxes where in some cases their own constituents are not all that happy, or on some of the more controversial things you may want to do on the healthcare front may not be as easy as well. So Reid will have his work cut out for him. I would mention one other thing about Senate Democrats. In some ways, to me, the most intriguing figure there is Chuck Schumer, who is a very different Chuck Schumer than the typical one who really was the Chuck Schumer that we knew 10 or 12 years ago, where the joke was the most dangerous place to be in Washington is between Chuck Schumer and a television camera. And as this sort of brash liberal who broke a lot of crockery. If you look at some of these deals that are being brokered, the filibuster deal that may or may not last now with the attempted filibuster against Chuck Hagel and some of the others that may move forward, but that deal, which was a delicate bipartisan deal. The work they're doing on immigration now, and the work on guns. Schumer has been a key go-between, figuring out how you can keep both parties in the tent and together. And he is an increasingly important figure in the Senate and with Senate Democrats. He'll be at the center of a lot of those disputes as they move forward, if they can find those deals. And some of them will be there. But Reid has his challenges within his own group, much less in his relationship with McConnell.
For an enlightening, entertaining, and very good.